The house was silent. Darkness shrouded every corner as Jade tiptoed down the hallway toward her nephew James's room. The air was charged with tension, and her heart was pounding, adrenaline coursing through her veins. He knew it was wrong, that crossing that line would change everything, but the thought of what he was about to do only increased his desire. There was no denying the magnetic attraction that had grown between them over the months. Every stolen glance, every accidental touch had built an unbearable tension. And that night, Jade would not resist any longer. She felt she had waited for that moment forever, and the anticipation sent shivers down her spine. Be sure to subscribe to my channel so I can continue to bring you more fascinating stories like this, she said. And don't forget to watch this video until the end, because this story is going to be incredibly interesting. His own thoughts echoed in his mind, a reminder of his life outside that moment, a life that now seemed so far away. As he gently pushed open the door, he held his breath and peered inside. The room was in semi-darkness, lit only by the soft moonlight filtering through the curtains, casting shadows on the bed where James lay. He looked so serene, lying on his back with one arm lazily abandoned above his head, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Jade's gaze remained on him, her pulse quickening as she absorbed every detail. The strong lines of his shoulders, the way his shirt clung to his chest, the faint hint of a beard along his jawline. She bit her lip, fighting the urge to retreat, but something deeper, something primal, held her there still. Her eyes trailed down his body, following the shape of him under the sheets, and a flush of heat flooded her. No, she would not go back, not now. Silently, she slipped inside the room, closing the door softly behind her. She hesitated at the foot of the bed, watching him for a moment, allowing herself to savor the sight of him. The room felt intimate, a private sanctuary, and her heart beat even faster. Slowly, she climbed onto the mattress, her movements cautious and deliberate as she settled beside him. The bed creaked slightly under her weight, but James did not move. Jade leaned in close, her breath warm against James's ear as she whispered his name. James. Her voice was low and seductive, imbued with a mixture of desire and fear. James moved slightly, his head turned in her direction, but he did not wake up. Jade's heart was beating wildly, the thrill of seeing him like this, completely unaware of what was about to happen. With each passing second, the anticipation grew. She lowered herself even more, her lips inches from James's cheek, and pressed a light kiss to his skin. He murmured softly in his sleep, his lips parting as if in response to her touch, and Jade held her breath, struck by the intimacy of the moment. Slowly, he slid his lips along her jaw, the kisses growing bolder as he moved up her neck, feeling his warm skin under her mouth, sensing his light scent made her head spin. She could not resist sliding her hand down his chest, her fingers gently tracing the contours of his muscles. James moved slightly beneath her, his brow furrowed, but still he did not wake up. Jade felt encouraged and leaned in further, her body pressing lightly against James's as she kissed the side of his neck. Her tongue came out to savor him, and that sensation made him gasp, his breath catching, and she smiled against his skin, feeling a wave of satisfaction. "James," she whispered again, her voice a seductive whisper, "wake up." James's eyes slowly opened, still veiled in sleep, and he looked at her, confusion flashing in his gaze as he tried to figure out what was going on. "Aunt Jade?" he murmured, his voice thick and sleepy. "What are you doing?" But before he could finish, she silenced him with a kiss, at first sweet and tender, then deeper, more demanding. James stiffened, his eyes widening in shock, but Jade did not flinch. She could feel how his body responded to her, sensed how his hesitation melted away as his lips began to move against hers. "Shh," she whispered, breaking the kiss just long enough to murmur against his mouth, her hands coming up to his face to hold him. "Let me do it, just this once." James let out a low, hopeless moan, hands rising to his waist, as if he could not contain himself. Jade took this as a signal to continue, kissing him harder, pouring every ounce of repressed desire into that kiss. James's resistance collapsed, and suddenly his hands were everywhere, moving up her back, entwined in her hair, pulling her closer as he kissed her, with a hunger equal to his own. Jade's heart beat wildly as she felt James move beneath her, his body arching to meet hers. Feeling his hard, hot presence beneath her made her moan softly, and she could not stop herself from moving against him in a slow, sensual motion. James's grip tightened on her hips. A desperate sound escaped his throat as he sank his face into her neck, his breathing labored and irregular. "Aunt Jade, we shouldn't," he murmured, his voice strained. But his words were lost when she kissed him again, her tongue slipping between his lips to entwine with his. James moaned, his hands sliding to her thighs, and Jade shuddered as his touch caused discharges of electricity in her. "Don't think," she whispered, her lips brushing against his ear. "Just feel." Then she kissed him again, her hands roaming over his body as if she wanted to memorize every inch of him. She felt James trembling beneath her, sensed how his body responded to her touch, and that only made her bolder. Slowly she slid her hand under his shirt, her fingers tracing his bare skin, and James let out a low, hopeless moan. "Jade," he breathed, his voice a strained whisper, but he did not push her away. Instead, his hands moved over Jade's body, exploring her curves, his touch hesitant at first, then increasingly sure as he realized she had no intention of stopping. Jade arched against him, her breath coming out in light, labored sighs as James's hand moved back up her hips, his fingers lightly grazing her ribs. Feeling his touch, the way he caressed her, made her head spin. She lowered herself, her lips sliding along his collarbone, her tongue coming out to taste him. James's hands tightened on her waist, his body trembling beneath her, and Jade could not stop herself from pressing closer, her hips moving against his in a slow, sensual rhythm. "Aunt Jade, please," he moaned, his voice desperate. But whether he was begging her to stop or to continue, Jade did not know. All she knew was that she could not stop now, not when he felt so right under her, not when she could feel how his body responded to hers. Slowly, Jade returned to kiss his mouth, her hands sliding over his chest as she kissed him deeply, passionately. James moaned between her lips, his hands roaming over her body, and Jade shivered as his touch caused shivers throughout her body. This was wrong, terribly wrong, but at that moment she didn't care. All that mattered was how James made her feel. Jade's heart beat furiously in her chest as she felt James's lips part under hers, resistance vanishing completely. His hand slid down Jade's back, under her t-shirt, brushing against her skin. The sensation caused her to let out a soft moan into his mouth. Jade kissed him deeper, her tongue sliding against his as she pressed her body closer and closer to his, feeling James's heat through the thin fabric of her clothes. She could sense James's hesitation, the trembling of his fingers as they explored her curves, but every time he tried to pull away for even a second, Jade captured his mouth again, kissing him harder, deeper, until he was breathless, trembling beneath her. The taste of James was intoxicating, driving her wild with desire, and she could not stop her hands from roaming, could not resist sliding her fingers to the hem of his shirt, lifting it up until the smooth skin of his abdomen was revealed. "James," she murmured against his lips, her voice low and rough. "I've wanted this for so long." He shuddered, his breath coming out in an uneven sigh as Jade leaned down, her lips sliding along his neck. He felt her pulse quicken under his mouth, felt her body stiffen as her hands moved over him, stroking every inch of bare skin she could reach. He was so hot, so strong, and the feel of him, the taste of him, made her head spin. "Aunt Jade, we can't," he whispered, his voice strained, but the way his hands tightened on her hips, the way her body arched against his, told a different story. He didn't want her to stop, not really. "Don't fight it," she whispered to him, her lips brushing against his ear. "Just let go." Then she kissed him again, her hands sliding across his chest, lifting his shirt higher and higher until he lifted his arms and let her take it off completely. Jade tossed it aside, her eyes darkening as she watched him. His broad shoulders, the defined muscles of his chest and abdomen, his skin glowing slightly in the moonlight. He was beautiful, every inch of him, and she could not resist the urge to lean down, her lips brushing lightly against his collarbone, then lower, kissing along his chest. James moaned, his hands entwining in her hair as Jade kissed him, his body trembling under her touch. Jade smiled against his skin, her tongue coming out to trace the lines of his muscles, relishing the way James shivered in response. She continued to kiss lower, down to his abdomen, her hands sliding over his hips, feeling the muscles tensing under her fingers. "Jade, I can't," he murmured, his voice a labored whisper. But Jade did not stop. She went back to kissing his mouth, her hands roaming over his chest, over his shoulders, then down to his hips as she straddled him, her body pressing against his in a way that made them both moan. "Does this feel wrong?" she whispered, her lips brushing against his ear as she moved her hips against him. A slow, sensual movement that made him moan softly. "Yes. I mean, no, I don't know," James stammered, his hands gripping her waist, as if he didn't know whether to pull her closer or pull her away. "Let go, James," Jade murmured, her voice soft and seductive. She leaned down, her lips capturing his in a deep, lingering kiss, her hands rising to cradle his face as she kissed him again and again, each kiss more passionate, more desperate than the last. James's resolve collapsed completely. He kissed her with a hunger equal to his own, his hands sliding down her back, pulling her closer as he rolled her beneath him, pinning her to the bed. Jade moaned softly, her heart pounding as he watched her, his dark eyes filled with a desire she had never seen before. "Aunt Jade, I can't stop," he murmured, his voice low and raw. "Then don't stop," she whispered back, her hands rising to entwine in his hair. "Don't stop." And then James kissed her again, his mouth hot and demanding against hers, as his hands moved over her body, touching and exploring, as if she could not get enough. Jade arched beneath him, her body trembling as James's hands moved down to her thighs, lifting her skirt, fingers lightly brushing against her bare skin. "James," she moaned softly, her hands gripping his shoulders as he descended to kiss her neck, his lips sliding over her collarbone, then lower. Feeling his mouth on her skin, the heat of his body pressed against hers was almost too much to bear. Each touch, each kiss, sent discharges of electricity through her, making her head spin. "I want you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, her hand sliding down James's back, pulling him closer, closer. "I want you so bad." James moaned, his hands tightening on her thighs as he kissed her again, his mouth hot and insistent against hers. Jade could feel the tension between them growing, felt the way James's body responded to hers, and that made her want him even more. She slid her hands down to the waistband of his pants, her fingers trembling as she began to unbutton them, her heart beating frantically in her chest. "James," she whispered again, her voice a low, labored whisper. "Please." James looked at her, his eyes dark and intense, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then, slowly, he leaned down, his lips lightly brushing hers in a kiss so sweet, so tender that it made her heart race. "I want you too," James whispered, his voice low and strained. Then he kissed her again, his hand sliding over Jade's body, touching and caressing her as if he couldn't get enough. Jade held her breath as his hands moved lower, his touch causing shivers down her spine. She arched against him, her body trembling with anticipation, and when his fingers finally grazed her most sensitive spot, Jade moaned, her hands gripping James's shoulders as a wave of pleasure swept over her. "James," she moaned softly, her voice a desperate plea. Then everything else vanished. The world, the consequences, everything vanished, leaving only the feeling of him, the way he touched her, the way he made her feel. At that moment, nothing else mattered. All that mattered was him and her, entwined in a forbidden embrace, their bodies moving in perfect synchrony as they surrendered to the desire that had been building up between them for so long. Jade felt as if they were suspended in time, lost in their own world where nothing else existed but the two of them. Each kiss, each caress deepened their connection, a connection that had always been there, but now erupted like a volcano, overwhelming them with raw passion. As their movements became more urgent, the room seemed to charge with electricity, the air thick with their shared need. Jade's hands explored every inch of James's body, enjoying the feel of his skin under her fingers, as if she wanted to imprint that moment in her memory forever. She could feel the muscles of his back tensing and flexing under her touch, and this drove her wild with desire. "Jade," whispered James, pulling away slightly to look into her eyes, searching for any sign of hesitation. "Are you sure you want this?" His voice was thick with desire and uncertainty. "I have never been more sure of anything in my life," Jade replied, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. The intensity of his gaze made her feel exposed, but she did not retreat. Instead, she raised her hand to caress his face, pulling him back to her with renewed fervor. Their lips met once more, and James's hands roamed Jade's body with more confidence. He explored her curves, each touch igniting a fire inside her that she never thought she could feel. Jade moaned softly as James's hands returned to her waist, pulling her closer as the kiss deepened. The outside world faded away. All that mattered was that moment, that connection. Jade's heart lifted, and she lost herself in the feeling of him against her, feeling desired and appreciated in a way she had never experienced before. They seemed to be the only two people in existence, their bodies entwined in a dance as old as time. As the kiss deepened, Jade felt herself slipping more and more into a stupor of desire, each breath mingling with his intoxicating scent. She wanted more, needed more, She slid her fingers down to the waistband of his pants, hesitating only a moment before taking the next step, unbuttoning them with trembling fingers. James's breath caught in his throat when he felt her touch, and he looked at her with an intensity that made her heart race. "Jade," he murmured, a warning and an invitation at the same time. With a combination of boldness and tenderness, Jade lowered his pants just enough to feel the warmth of his skin. The heat radiating from him made Jade's pulse quicken, and she delighted in the way he responded to her touch, in the way he seemed to lean toward her, as if he could never get enough. "You are incredible," James whispered, his voice low and hoarse, full of wonder as he watched her. "Only because of you," Jade replied, her voice little more than a whisper. "You make me feel alive." With a new urgency, Jade pulled him closer, their bodies fitting each other perfectly. Each touch, each kiss, became a promise of what was to come, a promise of exploration and discovery that sent shivers of excitement down her spine. As their bodies moved together, Jade felt more and more in tune with James, the way his body responded to hers, the way his breathing quickened with each caress. It was like two pieces of a puzzle finally fitting together after being separated for too long. In that moment, everything felt right, as if the universe had conspired to bring them together. The tension that had built up over the past weeks melted away, replaced by a sense of belonging that Jade never thought she would find. The world around them faded into nothingness, leaving only the sound of their mingling breaths, the soft whispers of skin against skin. With each kiss, with each caress, they ventured deeper into uncharted territory, exploring the depths of their desires without reservation. They were lost in each other, enveloped in a bubble of warmth and intimacy. It was a moment of pure connection, and neither of them wanted it to end. As they surrendered to the heat of the night, Jade realized that this was not just a physical attraction. It was a meeting of souls, a bond that transcended the moment. As dawn began to break outside, the first light of day filtering through the curtains, they remained entwined, breathing heavily, hearts beating in unison. For now, the world could wait. They had each other, and that was all that mattered. The story's over, but if you want to hear more intimate confession stories, click on one of the videos you see here on the screen, and remember to subscribe to the channel for intriguing new stories every day.